Ooh.
We've started.
We have. Okay, let's do this.
Sip&Talkers, welcome back to Sip&Talk. This is EP451-1, and today we've got quite a mix lined up. We're tackling some heavy stuff, macroeconomics, tricky policy moves, and then something really futuristic.
And robots. Seriously, that Chinese catwalk robot video, did you see it?
I did. It was incredibly smooth.
Too smooth, right? Like, impossibly smooth. It moved exactly like a high fashion model. I must have watched it like 5 times trying to spot the trick.
Well, you weren't alone. A lot of people were convinced it was just, really good CGI, or maybe someone in a very, very convincing suit. Pure publicity stunt, basically.
Oh, like it just looked, almost too human. The hip movement, the way its feet landed. I mean, it really makes you wonder, how good is this tech getting?
So the big question then, do you think it was a person faking it?
Honestly, part of me wants it to be real. The tech is just that amazing. But part of me thinks, maybe it was someone in a suit.
Well, based on the engineering reports and some of the internal videos they released later, I'm going to make you wait.
Oh, come on.
We'll circle back and reveal the truth behind that amazing catwalk at the end of our discussion today. It's worth the wait, trust me.
Okay, fine, you're cruel. But I'm really hoping it's a robot.
No.
Because if it's a person, wow, we are easily fooled these days.
We'll find out. But first, let's dive into today's market topics. What we're trying to do today is navigate this really kind of schizophrenic market environment.
That's a good word for it.
Yeah, you've got massive protectionism bubbling up on one side, then this absolutely insane level of investment in AI on the other, and just general policy uncertainty hanging over everything.
Right.
So we'll synthesize the latest U.S. political moves, try to figure out why global inflation is behaving so strangely, and then, look at that trillion-dollar bet on physical AI, which, you guessed it, brings us right back to that catwalk robot.
It really is the definition of a K-shaped world out there, isn't it? It's like 2 separate economies. We need to figure out what's driving that top leg of a K. The tech, the AI stuff that's flying high, and then what these other pressures like the tariffs and these populist policies are doing to the rest of the economy. The sort of traditional bit.
The bottom leg of the K.
Yeah, the bottom leg. It feels like a real tug of war between like the success the Fed had with monetary policy and the new risks coming from trade policy.
That tension is definitely the core theme today. So let's start with the political backdrop, because honestly, right now, policy decisions made way outside the usual Fed boardroom seem to be shaping the U.S. economy more than almost anything else. We really have to begin with some of the recent domestic political stuff, because even things that usually don't move markets much, like government shutdowns, seem to have more weight now, especially when they drag on.
Yeah, we just came out of a really long one, didn't we? A U.S. government shutdown that lasted, about 41 days?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Historically quite long.
Right. And when you think about all the services affected, the government contracts on hold, the federal employees, that length of time really starts to bite. It's not just a quick blip.
And typically, markets kind of just yawn at shutdowns.
Right. Usually, yeah. Investors, companies, they tend to treat it as temporary noise.
Yeah.
Political theater that'll eventually get sorted out.
But this time felt a bit different, maybe because it went on for so long. When it finally looked like there was an end in sight, specifically, I think, when the Senate started moving on the funding resolutions, we actually saw a pretty noticeable jump in stock prices.
Yeah, that was interesting. The market wasn't happy. The shutdown happened, obviously, but it was clearly relieved that the gridlock was breaking.
Right, a relief rally.
Exactly. It suggested that maybe investors were starting to worry about longer-term damage or policy paralysis the longer it dragged on. So the market basically priced in the good news as soon as the Senate acted, even though technically the House still needed to finalize everything.
It just showed how much stability, even temporary stability, is valued right now.
For sure. It really highlights how dependent market health is becoming on just basic political functionality. When the government looks like it can't even pass a budget, investors get nervous, and that nervousness can spill over.
Okay, so the shutdown crisis passed, but then the focus immediately shifted, didn't it?
And it started with that really big headline grabber, the tariff redemptions idea.
Yeah, walk us through that one again. It made quite a splash.
So the proposal, as it first hit the news, was pretty straightforward. Give every single American citizen a check for $2,000, a tariff redemption.
It's great on paper.
Politically, it's brilliant, right? Free money. And the narrative is, hey, this is funded by the tariffs those foreign countries are paying. It's immediate, tangible, feels good for voters.
But the math.
The math. That's where it got messy. When the analysts actually ran the numbers, the whole thing kind of fell apart pretty quickly.
How so?
Well, giving every citizen $2,000. The total cost is estimated somewhere around $600 billion, conservatively.
Okay, $600 billion. Big number.
Huge number. And here's the fundamental problem. That cost is roughly double what the government actually expects to bring in from all those tariffs in 2025, even with the new, really aggressive tariffs.
So the funding source they advertised doesn't actually cover it. Not even close.
Not even close. It creates this massive, immediate hole in the budget right out of the gate.
And the economists' reaction.
Predictably critical. They basically jumped on it, saying, look, even if you could magically find the money, injecting $600 billion of unfunded spending into an economy that's still trying to keep inflation under control, well, that's just asking for trouble. It pours fuel on the fire.
Right, likely makes inflation worse.
Exactly. The consensus was pretty clear. This looks like short-term populism, designed to win votes. But it would seriously blow out the national deficit and push the debt even higher. Not a sustainable fix.
Okay, but hold on. Didn't the administration try to backtrack almost immediately? I remember the Treasury stepping in and saying, well, maybe it's not literally a check.
Yeah, they did try to soften it. They floated ideas like, okay, maybe it's not cash. Maybe it's targeted tax benefits instead. Things like making overtime pay non-taxable, or tips, or maybe some deductions on Social Security income.
And possibly phasing it out over, 3 years.
Right, phasing it out. So the argument there from proponents was that targeting it through the tax system, maybe focusing on lower and middle income folks, could provide a needed boost to spending without being quite as inflationary as just handing out checks. Helping people deal with high rates, stimulating consumption where it's needed most.
Okay, so potentially less inflationary if targeted.
Potentially. But the critics immediately jump back in saying, look, first, the political damage is done. You promised a $2,000 check, and now it's this complicated, phased-out tax thing. That loses the simple populist appeal. That was the whole point.
Makes sense. It gets confusing.
Yeah, and second, even if it's phased in and targeted macroeconomically, it's still basically deficit spending. It increases demand in the economy without doing anything to increase the supply of goods and services. So the inflationary pressure is still there, maybe just delayed or spread out a bit. The fundamental issue doesn't go away.
Gotcha. Okay, what was the other big populist idea floating around? Something about housing.
Ah, yes, the 50-year mortgage.
50 years. I mean, that's practically turning home ownership into an inheritance plan.
It sounds pretty wild, doesn't it? But let's look at the justification they offered. The argument was basically that the biggest hurdle for first-time homebuyers right now isn't the price of the house itself, it's the monthly payment, especially with interest rates being higher.
Okay, affordability based on monthly cash flow.
Exactly. So if you stretch the loan term out to 50 years instead of the traditional 30, that monthly payment drops quite dramatically. In theory, this makes owning a home look more achievable for younger people, maybe helps with intergenerational wealth transfer, even if, you end up paying way more interest over the total life of the loan.
So the goal is attacking the monthly payment to boost accessibility.
That's the pitch. But critics pounced on this immediately, saying it's a classic example of trying to fix a supply problem with the demand-side solution. Meaning the real reason housing is so expensive isn't a lack of people who want to buy houses or can theoretically afford a monthly payment on the current pricey stock. The core issue is a massive shortage of actual houses available to buy. There just isn't enough supply.
Right. So making it easier for more people to afford the existing limited supply.
Just throws gasoline on the fire. It increases the number of bidders competing for the same few houses, which inevitably drives the overall price of those houses up even further.
So it could actually make the underlying problem worse.
Precisely. The critics argue that extending mortgage terms is just pumping up demand. The real solutions, they say, are much harder and take longer things on the supply side, like reforming zoning laws to allow more building, investing in infrastructure for denser housing, making construction itself cheaper and faster.
Yeah, those are the tough, slow, politically difficult fixes.
Exactly. While the 50-year mortgage is kind of a quick, flashy, populist Band-Aid that might feel good, but doesn't solve the fundamental shortage and could even be counterproductive long term.
Okay, so if that first part was about the domestic political drama, this next section is really about the friction that drama creates on the global stage, particularly with finance and trade. We're in this really weird spot where global markets seem almost fully priced, maybe even expensive.
Yeah, valuations feel stretched.
Yet at the same time, we've got this really complex, almost contradictory battle playing out between the Fed trying to keep things stable with monetary policy and the administration stirring things up with trade policy.
Let's start with the good news, because there has been some. Inflation, specifically U.S. CPI, has actually been a bit of a success story for the Fed lately.
Relatively speaking, yeah.
Right. It peaked way up at, 9.1% back in 2022, which was worrying. But since then, it's cooled off dramatically. As of late 2025, it's hovering around 3.0%.
Just much closer to the target.
Much closer. And most of that cooling is thanks to two things. One, the Fed hitting the brakes hard with all those interest rate hikes. And two, the global supply chains finally starting to work properly again after all the pandemic chaos.
Okay, so that's the positive side. The Fed did its job, supply chains healed. But now, the time bomb. The thing analysts seem really fixated on, these incredibly aggressive new trade policies, the protectionist stuff, sometimes called the Liberation Day tariffs.
Yeah, and these aren't small tweaks. We're not talking about adjusting tariffs by a couple of percent here and there.
No, these are huge shifts. You've got things like a massive 60% tariff slapped on imports from China.
60%?
Then there's a minimum 10% reciprocal tariff that hits basically everyone else globally. And they also got rid of those small import exemptions, the de minimis rule, which suddenly makes tons of cheap stuff bought online way more expensive.
Right. That hits e-commerce hard.
So when you add all these different measures together, the analysts calculate that the effective U.S. tariff rate, the average rate across all imports, has jumped up to around 22.5%.
22.5%. Just pause and think about that number historically.
It's incredibly high.
It's the highest the effective U.S. tariff rate has been since 1909. We're basically undoing over a century of movement towards freer global trade with these policies.
Okay, so logic would dictate massive new trade barriers, highest tariffs in 100 years. That should cause a huge immediate spike in inflation, right? If imports suddenly cost 20% more, shouldn't we see that on store shelves right away?
That's the logical assumption, and that's why the current situation is so counterintuitive and frankly fascinating to economists. Because, so far, we haven't seen that major sustained inflation spike directly linked to the tariffs.
Okay, so why not? This is the big puzzle.
This is a million-dollar question, or maybe the trillion-dollar question. Analysts point to basically three main reasons why that expected tariff inflation hasn't fully hit consumers yet.
All right, let's break them down. Reason one.
Reason one is the lag effect. Think of tariffs like a blockage in a long pipe. The pressure builds up, but it takes time for the effect to reach the end.
Okay.
The full price impact of tariffs usually takes anywhere from 6 to 12 months to really work its way through the entire supply chain and show up in consumer prices. And companies weren't caught totally flat-footed. They saw these policies coming in late 2024, early 2025.
So they prepared.
They did what's called front-loading. They imported absolutely massive quantities of goods, everything from electronics to clothes to toys, before the tariffs fully kicked in. They built up huge stockpiles.
So we're still basically working through that cheaper pre-tariff inventory.
Exactly. We're drawing down that reservoir. That buys some time.
Okay, that makes sense. Reason number two.
Reason two is cost absorption and what they call margin compression. Basically, companies are eating the cost, at least for now.
How does that work?
U.S. importers and big retailers think your Walmarts, Targets, Best Buys, they're absorbing a big chunk of the increased tariff costs themselves instead of immediately passing it all on to you, the consumer.
Why would they do that? Hurts their profits.
It does hurt their profits. Their margins get squeezed. But they're doing it because they're terrified of two things: losing market share to competitors who might hold prices lower for longer, or triggering a sticker shock effect where consumers just stop buying stuff if prices jump too quickly.
Okay, so they're sacrificing profit for market share and stability.
Temporarily, yes. And it's not just U.S. companies. At the same time, foreign exporters, especially the Chinese manufacturers facing that huge 60% tariff, they're also lowering their own prices, the price before the tariff is even applied.
Really? Why?
To try and offset the tariff impact and keep access to the giant U.S. consumer market, they're basically saying, okay, we'll make less profit on each item, but at least we can keep selling something in the U.S. They're compressing their margins, too.
So, in a weird way, the foreign exporters are kind of paying part of the tariff for the U.S. government.
Effectively, yes. They're eating a portion of it to stay competitive.
Wild. Okay, reason three.
Reason three is supply chain adjustment. Companies are scrambling and they're moving faster than many expected. They are rapidly trying to shift their sourcing away from heavily tariffed countries, mainly China.
Where are they going instead?
They're immediately ramping up orders and operations in countries with lower or zero tariffs. Think Vietnam, India, Mexico, other places in Southeast Asia. They're trying to reroute their supply chains on the fly.
Like a giant global shell game with factories.
Kind of. This geographical shift acts like a big pressure release valve. If you can find a new supplier in a country not hit by the big tariffs, you can avoid some of the price increase. It limits the overall inflationary impact.
Okay, so these three things, the lag, the cost absorption, the supply chain shuffle, they're acting like temporary buffers, masking the real hit.
Exactly. The Fed's earlier success against inflation plus these buffers are hiding the underlying risk from the tariffs. But here's the catch. That buffer period won't last forever.
Right. The pre-tariff inventory eventually runs out.
It runs dry, and companies can only squeeze their profit margins for so long before they have to pass on costs or risk going broke.
So the forecasts are starting to look less rosy for the future.
Yeah, most forecasts now suggest that these protectionist tariffs will start adding significantly to U.S. inflation, probably somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5 percentage points by 2026 and into 2027.
An extra half point to 1.5 points on top of the current 3%.
Potentially. And if that happens, it could easily push the overall CPI back up towards 4%, maybe even 4.5% or higher.
Which gets us dangerously close to
stagflation territory. That's the nightmare scenario. High inflation plus slowing economic growth caused by all the friction from the trade barriers. The political inflation, delayed but not denied, is likely coming.
And that puts the Federal Reserve in an absolutely brutal position, doesn't it?
Totally brutal. Imagine it's late 2025, early 2026. Inflation starts ticking back up, but it's clearly being driven by trade policy, by a political decision, not by an overheating economy in the traditional sense.
Right.
Does the Fed raise interest rates again to fight that inflation, even though raising rates would likely slow down an economy that's already being hampered by the trade friction itself?
It's like choosing between poison A and poison B.
Exactly. They'd be forced to choose between fighting inflation and trying to sustain economic growth. It's a policy dilemma they haven't really faced in decades, and it's created entirely by this clash between monetary and trade policy.
Okay, so that's the inflation tariff tension. Now, let's zoom out again globally. Despite all this friction and uncertainty, you said earlier that 2025 has actually been mostly positive for markets overall, biased towards growth.
Generally, yeah. If you just look at the headline numbers for major indices, particularly in the U.S., returns have been pretty good. Corporate earnings, especially in that top tier of tech companies, have been solid, and that's holding stock prices up.
But there's always a but.
There's always a but. This growth or optimism comes with serious valuation tension. The market isn't cheap. By most historical measures, overall market valuations are near peak levels.
So stocks are expensive.
Pretty expensive, yeah. And this is where that K-shape idea becomes really clear quantitatively. Let's look at the S&P 500 index. If you calculate the price-to-earnings ratio, the PE ratio, basically how much investors are willing to pay for each dollar of company profit, for the top 10 companies in the index, mostly the big tech AI-driven giants, that PE ratio is sitting around 28.
28? Is that high?
It's high. It's down just a tiny bit from a recent peak of maybe 30, but 28 is still right up there at a level that's been a kind of ceiling, a bottleneck for the past decade.
So investors are paying a huge premium for those top companies.
A massive premium. They're betting heavily that these companies will deliver huge future growth to justify that price. If that growth doesn't materialize, well, there's risk of a correction.
And that concentration is the K-shape.
That's the perfect illustration of it. Almost all the gains in the U.S. market are being driven by this handful of companies caught up in the AI boom. The chip makers, the cloud providers, the AI model developers, that's the top leg of the K, soaring upwards.
While the bottom leg?
The bottom leg is everything else. Traditional industries, manufacturing, consumer staples, smaller companies, sectors that rely more on stable global trade and predictable economic conditions. They're significantly lagging behind. They're not seeing the same growth or investor enthusiasm.
So if you happen to own a lot of those top AI-related stocks, your portfolio probably looks great.
You're probably feeling pretty good about 2025.
But if your investments are more spread out across the traditional economy,
your experience probably feels a lot less optimistic than the headline index numbers would suggest. It really highlights the divergence.
Okay, one more global piece here. While the U.S. is wrestling with potential inflation from tariffs, what's happening in China seems to be the opposite problem.
Exactly. It adds another layer of complexity to the global picture. China continues to act as a major source of deflationary pressure on the rest of the world.
Deflation meaning falling prices.
Falling prices, yes. They're essentially exporting deflation by flooding global markets with increasingly cheaper goods. Not just basic stuff like electronics and clothes anymore, but also more advanced things like solar panels, electric cars, machinery.
And this is because their own internal economy is struggling.
Largely, yes. Internally, China is facing really significant deflationary pressures. It reflects deep problems for their domestic companies and consumers. The property sector, which used to be a huge engine of growth, is in serious trouble. Housing prices in many big cities are reportedly down something like 27% year over year.
Wow, 27%.
Yeah, and it's hitting the consumer sector too. Car prices, for example, have plummeted. Estimates range from 16% to 27% down because of intense competition between domestic brands and just way too much production capacity.
So they have too much stuff and not enough buyers at home.
That seems to be a big part of it. And maybe the most worrying statistic reflecting this internal strain is this. Currently, over a quarter, 25% of all publicly listed companies in China are reporting losses.
1 in 4 companies losing money.
Yes. That's the highest level of corporate distress they've seen since the year 2000. It tells you their ability to make profits is severely squeezed by weak domestic demand and that massive overcapacity.
And that internal pressure forces them to sell cheap overseas.
It certainly incentivizes it. If you can't sell it at home, you try to sell it abroad, even at lower prices, just to keep the factories running and generate some cash flow. And this export push creates major shockwaves elsewhere, especially for industries in places like Europe.
You mentioned cars earlier. How is that playing out in Europe?
It's hitting Europe's auto industry really hard. Chinese electric vehicle brands like BYD and SAIC, they've rapidly gained significant market share in Europe. I think the figure is around 7.4% now and growing fast.
Which puts pressure on the established European brands.
Immense pressure,
Right.
because the Chinese EVs are often very good quality and significantly cheaper. Europe's legacy car makers, who have traditionally relied on high profit margins, are struggling to compete on price.
Is there a specific example of this?
Yeah, there's a pretty stark one that's been reported. Take Porsche, the icon of German luxury and high performance. They used to enjoy operating margins close to 20%, which is huge.
Very profitable.
Extremely profitable, but now facing this intense competition from high-quality, lower-priced alternatives, especially electric ones from China, Porsche's operating margin has reportedly collapsed. Some reports put it as low as just 3%.
From 20% down to 3%, that's devastating.
It's a catastrophic drop. It essentially turns a premium luxury brand into something closer to a commodity producer in terms of profitability. And it shows just how potent this deflationary export wave from China can be. Industry leaders in Europe are genuinely worried because their old business models just don't work against this kind of price competition.
Okay, so that's the complex macro picture. Great. Now let's shift gears and focus on what's driving that top leg of the K-shape, the absolute frenzy of investment in AI infrastructure. This is where the really, truly mind-bending amounts of money are flowing.
Yeah, mind-bending is the right word. What's really striking here is just the sheer scale of the capital being committed. We're not talking normal venture capital rounds anymore. This is like nation-state level spending.
And a lot of it seems centered around OpenAI.
OpenAI is definitely at the epicenter, yeah. As a private company leading the charge in generative AI, they've managed to amass funding commitments totaling, wait for it, $1.4 trillion.
$1.4 trillion.
For one company.
1.4 trillion. Just let that number sink in for a second. It's astronomical. And almost all of that capital is earmarked for basically two things: securing access to the most advanced computer chips and building out absolutely massive hyperscale data centers all over the world.
They're literally building the physical foundation for the AI future.
That's exactly what they're doing. And understanding how they got that funding is also key. The breakdown of the major contracts tells a story. You've got huge commitments like $300 billion from Oracle,
$100 billion.
$250 billion from Microsoft, another $38 billion from Amazon Web Services. But here's the interesting part. Analysts suggest a lot of this isn't traditional investment, like buying shares or lending money.
So what is it? A significant chunk appears to be massive prepaid consumption contracts. These big tech giants are essentially paying OpenAI huge sums upfront to guarantee themselves access to OpenAI's future AI computing power years in advance.
So they're pre-buying compute time on a massive scale.
Exactly. It gives OpenAI the guaranteed capital they need to build everything now, while locking in these tech giants who are betting their own futures on having access to that cutting-edge AI capability. It's a very symbiotic, if potentially risky, relationship.
And that's just OpenAI's funding. What about the big tech companies themselves?
They're spending like crazy too. The big players, Meta, Alphabet, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, they're forecast to spend collectively something like $400 billion in 2026 just on building their own AI data centers.
$400 billion in 1 year.
In 1 year. And that's actually an increase of about $2 billion from what they're spending this year, which was already a record amount.
It's an arms race, pure and simple.
It's an absolute arms race for future dominance. They believe, probably correctly, that whoever owns the most powerful AI infrastructure will control the next era of technology. And this incredible demand creates enormous bottlenecks elsewhere.
Specifically in chip manufacturing.
Absolutely. The bottleneck is silicon. Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, who are basically the kings of AI chips right now, has publicly said he's pushing TSMC, the main chip manufacturer, for more production because they simply cannot make chips fast enough to meet demand.
So TSMC must be doing well.
TSMC is forecasting record sales, naturally. The constraint isn't really money at this point. The tech giants have the capital. The constraint is the physical reality of manufacturing these incredibly complex chips, building the fabrication plants, the fabs, and crucially, finding enough energy and water to power and cool these massive data centers.
Right, the physical world limitation.
Exactly. Those become the real limiting factors in this digital arms race.
Okay, so everyone's spending trillions. But this level of spending, especially the interconnected nature of it, must be attracting some scrutiny, right? Why the absolute frenzy?
Well, part of it is definitely about winning what you could call the mind share battle. They need to convince investors, the market, and the public that they can actually pull this off, that they can sustain this incredibly expensive game.
Meaning they have to hit those huge revenue targets they're promising, like OpenAI talking about $1 trillion eventually.
Exactly. They need to show they can actually complete these massive infrastructure projects by their target dates, like 2030, and then generate enough revenue from them to justify the colossal upfront investment. It's about proving the vision is real and the astronomical valuations are warranted.
But isn't there a transparency issue, especially with a private company like OpenAI leading the charge?
That's definitely becoming a bigger point of discussion. OpenAI, because it's private, doesn't face the same strict public disclosure rules as a Google or a Microsoft. Their internal finances, their governance structure, even the exact terms of some of these massive deals, a lot of it lacks public transparency.
And that interconnected funding model you mentioned, the big tech companies basically paying each other for compute power. Does that raise flags?
It's starting to attract some skepticism from certain analysts.
Yeah.
Some see it as potentially creating a fragile ecosystem, almost like a house of cards, where if one major player stumbles, it could have knock-on effects. Or at least it's a very complex, interwoven financial structure that maybe needs more critical analysis than traditional corporate finance models usually provide. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's unusual and warrants caution.
Are we seeing any signs of that caution affecting related companies?
We are starting to see some signs, yeah. Take a company like CoreWeave. They specialize in providing cloud computing services specifically tailored for AI workloads, basically renting out the infrastructure others need.
Okay, so they're like a picks and shovels play in the AI gold rush.
Exactly. And their revenue growth has been phenomenal, absolutely exceeding expectations, are growing incredibly fast. But the market has noticed that they aren't reducing their net losses as quickly as initially hoped.
Meaning they're spending a lot to achieve that growth.
Precisely. They're burning through cash to build out capacity and grab market share. And that specific data point is seen as a signal. It suggests that even in this high-growth AI infrastructure space, massive revenue doesn't automatically translate into immediate, sustainable profitability.
So investors are starting to differentiate.
It seems like it. They're starting to look more closely and ask, is this company just burning capital to grow fast, or can it actually build a profitable long-term business from these huge upfront investments? The initial euphoria might be tempering slightly with a demand for seeing actual results, not just promises. Show me the money, not just the spending.
Okay, let's take all that incredible AI compute power and infrastructure spending and connect it to the physical world. Because ultimately, that's where a lot of this investment is headed into robots. Which brings us full circle, back to that amazing catwalk robot we started with.
Right. Payoff time. So, Joe, was that super smooth Chinese catwalk robot a person in a suit or the real deal?
Drum roll, please.
The engineering evidence, the videos, it's all conclusive. It was 100% a real robot, no person involved.
Wow. Okay, that's genuinely impressive. The realism was uncanny.
It really was. The robot is called Iron, and it's the new generation humanoid from the Chinese company XPeng. They unveiled it at their tech day, and yeah, it went viral instantly, precisely because that catwalk strut looked so fluid, so natural, that it just sparked worldwide disbelief. Everyone assumed it had to be fake.
So how did XPeng prove it was real?
Well, the skepticism was so intense that the chairman of XPeng, He Xiaopeng, took a pretty unusual step. He released a video that was explicitly single take and unedited. No cuts, no tricks.
And what did the video show?
It showed the robot doing the catwalk movement, but crucially, parts of its outer shell were removed or made transparent, so you could literally see the internal mechanics working as it moved. You saw the joints articulating, the actuators firing, the bionic muscles and spine structure moving. It was undeniable proof, pure mechanics and AI in action.
Okay, so what's the secret? How do they achieve that level of smooth, natural movement that fooled so many people? Is it just better software?
Software is part of it, of course, the AI brain. But a huge part of the breakthrough is actually in the fundamental mechanical design. The engineers added something really clever called passive freedom in the robot's foot and ankle joints.
Passive freedom, what does that mean?
Think about how a human walks. Your foot isn't rigidly locked. It has some natural give. It flexes, it absorbs shock, it adjusts subtly to uneven surfaces. This passive freedom in Iron's feet mimics that. It allows the foot to yield slightly under pressure, to absorb the impact of landing, and to make those tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments that create the natural sway and weight distribution you see in a human gait.
So it moves naturally because it's designed to kind of give a little, like a real foot.
Exactly. It can fail gracefully, biomechanically speaking, which ironically makes the movement look more perfect and fluid. It's not just about forcing rigid movements, it's about designing in that natural compliance.
Fascinating. And what about the brain and power?
Beyond the clever mechanics, it's got some serious tech packed in. It uses a full solid-state battery, which gives it better power density and potentially longer operating times. It's loaded with high-precision sensors to understand its environment in real time. And then there's the AI brain, which is based on what they call the VLT plus VLA plus VLM physical world large model.
Okay, alphabet soup time. VLT, VLA, VLM. Break that down for us.
Right, let's pack that. Think of it in layers.
Yeah.
VLT stands for Visual Language Transformer. This is the part that lets the robot see the world through its cameras and understand human language instructions related to physical objects and actions, like pick up the red box on the table.
Okay, so vision plus language understanding.
Exactly. Then VLA is visual language action. This layer takes that understanding and translates it into the actual physical movements needed to perform the task. It plans the sequence of joint movements.
Got it. Understanding into action.
And finally, VLM is the overarching visual language model. This is the big foundational AI model that integrates everything: perception, seeing, language, understanding instructions, and action moving into one cohesive system. It allows the robot to process complex scenes, reason about tasks, and act autonomously in the physical world. That integration is the key breakthrough, enabling more general capabilities.
So it's not just programmed for one specific movement. It can potentially learn and adapt.
That's the goal. It's moving towards more general physical intelligence. Now, what's XPeng planning to do with Iron?
Their aim is commercial deployment fairly soon. They're targeting scale production starting around 2026. Initially, they see it filling roles in commercial service environments, maybe as guides in factories or showrooms, sales assistants, possibly even light security tasks.
So interacting with people in controlled settings first. Seems like it. The big question mark or limitation right now is how well it handles really complex, uneven terrain. Most demonstrations we've seen are on flat ground. Things like stairs, obstacles, slippery surfaces that adaptability still needs to be proven at scale. But the core platform is clearly working, and working incredibly well.
Okay, so XPeng's Iron is grabbing headlines with its movement quality. But when you talk about sheer scale, ambition, and maybe market leadership potential, you still have to talk about Tesla and Optimus, right? The Tesla bot.
Absolutely. Tesla's vision for Optimus is incredibly ambitious, maybe even more so than XPeng's current focus. It's not just about specific service roles. Musk envisions Optimus as a truly general-purpose, autonomous humanoid robot.
General purpose meaning it could do almost anything a human does.
That's the ultimate goal. The stated purpose is to perform tasks that are currently done by humans but are considered unsafe, repetitive, or dull. Think factory work, logistics, maybe even elder care or household chores eventually. It's aimed at broad labor replacement.
And Tesla's big advantage here is leveraging all their work on self-driving cars. That's the core strategy. They plan to use the same fundamental AI that powers their full self-driving FSD system, the computer vision, the neural networks, the path planning algorithms to enable Optimus to operate autonomously.
So the robot doesn't need to be explicitly programmed for every single task?
Ideally, no. Just like a Tesla car uses its sensors and AI to navigate a complex road environment, Optimus would use its sensors and AI to perceive the world, understand its task, and figure out how to move and manipulate objects to achieve its goal, all without direct human control or pre-programming for that specific scenario. That ability to see, interpret, and act autonomously in unstructured environments, that's the holy grail for general-purpose robotics.
And Elon Musk being Elon Musk, the scale he's talking about is just astronomical.
Completely off the charts. He's publicly forecasted that the Optimus program alone could add something like $2 to $3 trillion to Tesla's future market valuation.
2 to 3 trillion, just from the robot.
Yes. He's even suggested it could eventually account for maybe 80% of Tesla's total value. He's basically saying Tesla's future is robotics, even more than cars.
That's a massive bet. Are they making progress towards production?
They are. The third generation of the Optimus prototype is apparently already in trial production. The goal is to move towards large-scale volume manufacturing starting next year.
But here's the really critical piece of Musk's plan. The cost target.
Right, he mentioned a specific price point.
He did. He's aiming to get the production cost under $20,000 per robot.
Under $20,000. Why is that number so important?
Because that's the tipping point for mass adoption. Think about it. If you can buy a capable humanoid robot for less than the price of an average new car, say a Honda Civic, and significantly less than the annual cost of employing a human worker, wages, benefits, insurance, etc.,
then the economics for businesses become undeniable. Exactly. For companies in manufacturing, warehousing, logistics, maybe even agriculture or elder care, the return on investment for deploying fleets of these robots becomes incredibly compelling, almost inevitable, especially if they're struggling with labor shortages or rising labor costs. That sub-$20K price point is designed to make automation irresistible.
Okay, but getting from a cool prototype to mass-producing millions of reliable robots at that price point, that's a huge challenge, right?
Absolutely massive. It's one thing to build a few dozen advanced prototypes.
Yeah.
It's entirely different to manufacture millions of them reliably and cheaply. Think about the complexities, especially things like the hands. Optimus needs sophisticated multi-fingered hands to manipulate a wide variety of objects.
Right. Delicate enough for some tasks, strong enough for others.
Exactly. Designing and mass-producing a hand that is dexterous, durable, and cheap is an enormous engineering and manufacturing hurdle that still needs to be fully overcome for that kind of scale. The path from prototype to mass market is still very complex.
Okay, so we have these incredible individual robots like Iron and Optimus emerging. Let's put them in the context of the broader investment picture for robotics. Are these just flashy projects, or is this where serious money is flowing?
Oh, the money is flowing, and the growth projections are frankly staggering. This really looks like it could be the defining investment theme for the second half of this decade.
Can you give us some numbers like compound annual growth rates, the CIGR forecasts out to 2030?
Yeah, the numbers clearly show where the explosive growth is expected.
Yeah.
If you look at the traditional robotic sectors, industrial robots, the kind you see in car factories, they're still growing at a healthy clip, maybe a 14% CAGR. That market is projected to go from about $18 billion today to around $35 billion by 2030. Solid growth.
Okay, 14%. Respectable.
Then you have service robotics, things like logistics robots in warehouses, delivery drones, robots used in healthcare. That sector is growing even faster, projected at a very strong 33% CAGR. That takes it from roughly $12 billion today up to $50 billion by 2030.
33%, that's very robust.
Very robust. But then you get to humanoid robots, the Irons, the Optimuses, the Figures. The forecast here is just an explosion. The projected CAGR is 110%.
110% per year.
Per year, on average, through 2030. That takes the market from what's currently a pretty small niche, maybe $500 million, 0.5 B today, to an estimated $38 billion by 2030.
Wow. From $500 million to $38 billion in just 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, it's a 76-fold increase. That kind of exponential growth curve tells you the industry is widely expected to transition rapidly from the R&D and prototype phase into real commercial deployment and viability within this decade.
Okay, so if that's the potential, what are the key ways investors are trying to play this? What are the main investment themes?
You can kind of break it down into a few layers.
Yeah.
First, there are the companies making the trillion-dollar bet, the ones actually building and selling the integrated humanoid robots. That's obviously Tesla with Optimus. You've also got Figure AI, which is interesting because it's heavily backed by OpenAI and Microsoft, and they're initially focusing on robots for warehouse and logistics tasks.
Right, targeting a specific commercial need first.
Exactly. And then there's Agility Robotics, who make the Digit robot, the one that looks a bit like a bird, and they already have deployment partnerships with major companies like Amazon, expected to scale up starting in 2026. So those are the big players building the actual robots.
Okay, the robot makers, layer 2.
Layer 2 is the AI compute power, the brains, and the training infrastructure behind the robots. And right now, that's largely dominated by NVIDIA.
Selling the picks and shovels again.
Pretty much. They're not making the robot bodies, but their specialized platforms like Isaac and their new chips like the GR00T NPU are providing the essential AI software development kits, simulation tools, and the raw processing power needed to train and run these sophisticated robot AIs. Analysts see this robot-specific compute market alone as potentially being a $100 billion annual revenue opportunity just for NVIDIA down the road.
$100 billion just from powering robots. Okay, what's the third layer?
The third layer is the crucial, often overlooked supply chain enablers. These are the companies making the highly specialized components that go into the robots. And this is often where you find hidden monopoly power.
Like what kind of components?
Precision gears are a huge one. You need incredibly precise, high-torque, yet compact gears for all those smooth, powerful joint movements in a robot's arms, legs, wrists. The kind of thing that makes Iron's catwalk or Optimus's hand movements possible.
And who makes those?
That market segment is almost entirely dominated by just two Japanese companies, Harmonic Drive Systems and NABPESCO. They essentially have a joint monopoly on these critical high-precision reduction gears. Any company wanting to build a high-performance robot at scale basically has to buy from them.
Wow, a hidden duopoly. Anything else in that layer?
Yeah, you also need to look at things like high-density sensors, the eyes and ears of the robot, and advanced actuators, which are like the muscles that drive the movement. Companies specializing in those niche high-performance components are also key enablers.
Okay, that makes sense. And crucially, how does all this tie back to the macro policy stuff we talked about earlier? The tariffs, the protectionism.
Right, it connects directly. These U.S. industrial policies, things like the CHOPS Act, which incentivizes domestic semiconductor manufacturing, and the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, which has credits for domestic clean energy and manufacturing, they act as major structural tailwinds for this domestic robotics boom.
How so?
Well, they provide huge financial incentives for companies like Tesla, Figure AI, even NVIDIA and their suppliers to build their factories and conduct their R&D in the United States. Billions in subsidies and tax credits are flowing towards domestic AI and manufacturing capabilities.
So it encourages building the robots here.
Yes. And then conversely, the tariffs, we discussed the high tariffs on imported goods, especially from China, make it more expensive to import robot components or even fully assembled robots from overseas.
So it makes the domestic option relatively cheaper.
Exactly. The combination of subsidies for domestic production and tariffs on imports creates a strong economic incentive for companies to build and buy American-made robots and components. It's estimated these policies are driving well over $300 billion in related domestic capital expenditure by 2030. The government's policy is effectively trying to accelerate the adoption of automation, but specifically domestically produced automation. Okay, before we wrap things up with key takeaways, we wanted to touch on one more related, though slightly separate, policy issue that's been getting a lot of attention globally. It speaks to those deeper societal frictions that economic and cultural changes can create.
Yeah, it's a really striking example of a different kind of protectionism, not about trade, but about protecting the welfare state and maybe national identity. We're talking about the dramatic policy shift that's happened in Denmark.
Denmark. Weren't they always seen as, like, the model of a generous, welcoming, social democratic welfare state?
Historically, yes. They were very proud of their comprehensive welfare system and their humanitarian values. But over the last decade or so, particularly accelerating after the 2015 European migration crisis, Denmark has undergone a really profound pivot. They've moved towards an incredibly strict anti-immigration stance, even stating an explicit policy goal of aiming for 0 asylum seekers.
0. That's extreme. What drove such a massive change?
It seems to boil down to two interconnected things: social trust and fiscal sustainability. The argument made within Denmark was that their very generous welfare system fundamentally depends on a high degree of social trust among the population and a broadly shared consensus about work, contribution, and cultural norms.
Okay, so a shared understanding is needed for the system to work.
That was the argument. And the government contended that the integration of large numbers of non-Western migrants, particularly from the Middle East and North Africa, put a severe strain on both that social cohesion and the fiscal budget supporting the welfare state.
Was there data to back that up? Or was it more perception?
There was specific data cited that became politically very powerful. A government report back in 2018 calculated that non-Western migrants and their descendants created a net fiscal burden, meaning they cost the state more in services than they contributed in taxes, of about 31 billion Danish kroner per year. That's roughly 4.2 billion euros annually.
A significant cost.
A direct measurable cost that resonated politically. Additionally, there were social metrics highlighted, like statistics showing that while immigrant populations made up about 14% of residents, they accounted for disproportionately higher rates of certain crime convictions, around 29% for violent crime, according to those reports. This combination, the perceived fiscal drain plus the erosion of social cohesion metrics, provided the political fuel for the dramatic policy shift.
And interestingly, this shift wasn't solely driven by far-right parties, was it?
No, and that's what makes the Danish case study so significant globally. The mainstream center-left Social Democratic Party effectively adopted many of the hardline immigration stances previously associated with the far right. The political calculation, apparently, was that this was necessary to win back voters who were drifting rightward over these issues, and ultimately to protect the core welfare model itself by limiting the perceived burdens on it.
So what kind of specific measures did they implement? They sound controversial.
Extremely controversial and deliberately designed to make Denmark seem as unattractive as possible to asylum seekers. One of the first really high-profile ones was the so-called jewelry law passed back in 2016.
The jewelry law?
Yeah, it allowed police to literally confiscate cash and valuables like jewelry worth more than about $1,500 from arriving asylum seekers. The stated purpose was to make asylum seekers contribute towards the cost of their own upkeep. The symbolism, however, was seen by many as brutal and dehumanizing.
Wow. Okay, what else?
Then came the even more interventionist ghetto package. This policy allowed the government to officially designate certain neighborhoods with a high percentage, I think over 50% of residents with non-Western backgrounds, as ghettos.
They actually use the word ghetto.
Officially, yes. And living in one of these designated areas came with special rules. For example, it mandated that toddlers starting from age 1 had to attend at least 25 hours per week of compulsory childcare.
Compulsory childcare for 1-year-olds. Why?
The stated goal was to instill Danish values, things like democracy, gender equality, the Danish language from a very early age, often counter to the cultural norms or wishes of the parents. It represented a really profound level of state intervention into family life, justified as necessary for forced cultural assimilation and preserving the broader social fabric.
That's incredibly invasive.
Highly invasive. And then, perhaps the most extreme measure was the Rwanda Plan. Denmark passed legislation enabling them to basically offshore their entire asylum processing system. The plan is to fly asylum seekers who arrive in Denmark directly to Rwanda in Central Africa to have their asylum claims processed there.
So they never even really enter Denmark or access the Danish system.
Exactly. Even if their claim is eventually successful, the plan suggested they might be granted asylum in Rwanda, not Denmark. It effectively removes Denmark's obligation under international conventions by ensuring asylum seekers never physically reach Danish territory where they could claim those rights.
Has this whole package of policies had an effect?
A dramatic effect. The number of asylum applications in Denmark has plummeted. And this Danish model, where mainstream political parties adopt hardline immigration policies to preempt the far right and respond to perceived social and fiscal pressures, is being watched very closely, and in some cases actively replicated, by other Western European nations facing similar demographic shifts and integration challenges. It's a major global political trend, connecting back to that broader theme of protectionism, whether it's protecting domestic industries or protecting a perceived national culture and welfare system.
Okay, that was a lot to cover. Let's try to synthesize the key takeaways for you Sip&Talkers from this wide-ranging discussion.
Let's do it. So first, the big macro picture. We seem to be settling into a higher-for-longer interest rate reality, partly thanks to the Fed's relative success in bringing down that core inflation from its peak. But that stability is now seriously complicated by two big things. unpredictable populist fiscal policies like those unfunded tariff redemption promises, and this new aggressive wave of trade protectionism. Meanwhile, global markets feel very stretched on valuation, propped up almost entirely by that hypergrowth concentrated in the tech and AI sector.
Got it. Second key point.
The major policy tension to watch is definitely the clash between trade policy and monetary policy. Those new tariffs are building up serious inflationary pressure that hasn't fully hit yet because of those temporary buffers, inventory, cost absorption.
Right, the lag effect.
Exactly. When that buffer period inevitably ends, likely sometime in 2026, that delayed inflation will create a huge headache for the Fed. Do they fight politically driven inflation with rate hikes and risk tipping the economy into a stagflationary slowdown? It's a major conflict brewing.
And finally, the future is robotic.
The robot future seems closer than ever. Humanoid robotics, showcased by the technical leaps of things like Xpeng's Iron and driven by the sheer scale and ambition of Tesla's Optimus, is now clearly the fastest growing major investment sector globally. That 110% CAGR tells the story.
Powered by AI platforms like NVIDIA's.
Powered by NVIDIA, fueled by the urgent need for solutions to labor shortages and costs, and boosted by industrial policy. We're seeing the transition from sci-fi concept to commercial reality happening much faster than expected. It really does feel like this will be the decade of physical AI.
Okay, before we completely sign off, just the essential reminder. Neither of us are financial experts or registered investment advisors.
Absolutely not. All the data, the analysis, the numbers we talked about today, it's all for informational and discussion purposes only. Please, please, always do your own research and consult with a qualified professional before making any investment decisions based on anything you hear here.
Couldn't say it better myself. Okay, and to leave you all with one final thought to chew on, let's circle back to those robot price points.
The $20,000 target for Optimus.
Exactly. Tesla, Xpeng, Figure AI, they're all aiming for that mass market price point, making these incredibly capable humanoid robots cheaper than the average new car. So here's the question. If a robot can reliably and safely perform the vast majority of physical tasks currently done by humans, the dangerous ones, the repetitive ones, maybe even some complex ones, and it costs less than a Honda Civic, does that finally solve the global labor shortage problem we keep hearing about?
That's the optimistic view, right? Robots fill the gaps, boost productivity, maybe make life easier.
Or does hitting that price point trigger something else? Does it fundamentally and permanently devalue most forms of human physical labor on a global scale? Could it lead to massive technological unemployment, widespread social unrest, and eventually force governments to implement radical policy responses like the robot taxes that unions are already starting to discuss just to manage the transition?
Yeah, when the cost of automating a job drops below the cost of a basic appliance, does the entire social contract around work and value need to be rewritten? The kind of cultural protectionism we saw in Denmark might seem tame compared to the potential political backlash aimed at protecting human jobs from mass automation.
That is definitely a heavy question to mull over, Sip&Talkers.
Right.
Something to think about long after this discussion ends. Thank you so much for joining us today as we navigated the macro maze and peeked into the physical AI future.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time for another.
Well, another talk over metaphorical sips. But first, we absolutely have to give the mandatory shout out to our good friend Mickey and his YouTube channel, Mickytolife.
Check it out. He's got some really fun memes, great travel vlogs. Usually
being the key word.
I mean, seriously, the guy is so lazy sometimes. He goes on this epic trip straight from Europe to South Korea. Sounds amazing, right? And then the vlog updates just stopped.
Yeah.
Completely vanished.
Update.
Yeah, Mickey. What happened? Did you fall into a kimchi vat?
Yeah.
We need content. Your adoring public demands travel vlogs. Stop eating all the delicious street food and start editing.
Seriously, Mickey, get back to work. We're waiting.
Okay. Enough Mickey shaming. We'll catch you all next time. Don't forget to subscribe to Sip and Talk wherever you get your podcasts or audio content.